the screen right now.
Awesome. So first, Halito Inaka, Sahochifo Yat Tier Cash, Chata, Lusa, Sia, Hoke, Chalegi, Amachokma Hoke. So my name is Tier Cash. I am Black American, Chata, and with Cherokee descent as well. And I'm very excited to be here. And I do that introduction for a few reasons. The first is that there are only 2,000 elders who speak this language. And so we have been tasked to continue to make sure that this lives on through our bodies and through our words. And because we're discussing, representation in athletics, but secondly, because that guy up there is my grandfather. I am the granddaughter of Lee Calhoun, who was also Black and Indigenous. And he is a two-time gold medal Olympian and the first to win back-to-back gold medals in the 100 and 10 hurdles and the 56 and 60 Olympics. And so I'm going to give you just a very small bit about my own personal background and the story behind this photo, just to introduce this panel and to get us really thinking about what representation in athletics means. So between 1956 and 1960, my grandfather, who I will affectionately call Opa, as I called him, and my grandmother, who I'll affectionately call Oma, got married. And this is how they did it. They went to Paris and got married on TV. To get, right? Just how everyone gets married. To give you a bit of background on how this happened, my grandmother applied for this TV show that used to air back in the 50s and the 60s, and was chosen without my grandfather's consent to be a part of this TV show. And so, of course, if you know my Oma, you also know that you have no say in what happens after that. And so my grandfather actually decided to go on this TV show with her, and they went and participated in this beautiful ceremony. After participating in this beautiful ceremony, when AAU found out, however, because this is the time between the 56 and 60 Olympics, so my grandfather was still an athlete, they suspended him from sports because he was no longer an amateur in their eyes, because my grandmother accepted gifts as a part of being married. And so this took away his amateur status. This is, discussed further in a paper co-authored by myself, Dr. York Krieger, and Dr. Austin Duckworth called You May Kiss Your Bride, the Curious Amateur Rules Violation of Double Olympic Champion Lee Calhoun. And so I'll say that you can read more of the story there, but this is important. And why is it important? Well, this begins this unintentional journey of athlete activism that has led me here today to be able to speak in front of you. So between 1958 and 1960, many people came to my grandfather's aid and solidarity, including a lot of famous athletes at the time. Folks who were also within these institutions and organizations said that this was also wrong. They protested this unfair amateur rule that would set the precedent for many of the changes that we have today. In 1968, when John Carlos and Tommy Smith raised their fists in solidarity with the Black Americans, the poor, and other systemically marginalized groups, my grandfather would actually be the person to tell them, as their coach, this news. And this horrifying news would continue to stay with him, and he would regret it for the rest of his life. In 1985 to the 2000s, my mother would become the first Black woman in the CUSA conference to win multiple track and field titles. And in 2022, I'm here now moderating a panel on athlete representation. So this is activism, right? This is the work, and I'm the proof. And in this spirit, I want to make sure that I let you know that I'm excited to introduce our panel today, who are talking about these really interesting concepts, this really interesting work of representation in athletics. And so I'm going to introduce Jules Boykoff, Mads Brooks Bolyard, Robert Coher, and York Krieger. And they're going to give about 10 minutes of a short talk, and then we'll open the floor for a healthy discussion and debate. And so we'll have a chance to hear from them in these aspects. So I will turn the floor over to you.
Oops. Close that. Skip that. There you go. Okay. Was it? Yeah, I think it went too. Yeah, let's just go. Okay, thank you so much, Tiara, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today. I'm going to just jump right in here. You might have remembered from the Beijing Olympics. How do you click it forward? Let's see here, maybe that. No. Oh, there we go. How about this? Okay, you may remember from the Beijing 2022 Olympics, this athlete from the Ukraine held this sign up, and you can read it sort of there, no war in Ukraine is what the sign said. And this was in violation, one might think, of this rule in the Olympic Charter, Rule 50, that you'll be hearing about quite a bit today, and I'll return to shortly, that outlaws engaging in politics at the Olympic Games. So there's an example of athlete activism very recently. There's also been a lot of activism in the streets. This was from Paris just last month, where I was following the second ever transnational anti-Olympic summit that happened there. And so what I want to argue today is that it's actually movements, including anti-Olympic movements, but also wider movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, that make space for athlete activist moments. And so I'm going to kind of trace out that history and that interchange today for you. Now, it'll be no surprise to many people in the room that whenever the Olympics gets announced as possibly coming to your city, we see activists rising up to question, why are we going to do this? They're going to cost so much money. There's going to be some environmental destruction, militarization of public space. People are going to get displaced from their homes. Everyday working people who might not even be able to afford a ticket to the Olympics. And we've also seen more and more athletes rising up. One of the major themes of this panel, and I can't wait to hear from all of our panelists on this topic. So what I want to do is kind of trace out some examples from history to set the context for our other presenters today. This is a heck of a story. This guy's name is Peter O'Connor, an Irish athlete who was forced to compete for Great Britain at the 1906 Olympics in Athens. He was not happy about that fact. Ireland was being ruled by Westminster at the time. And so he wore this stylish bright green coat with a golden shamrock on it. And during the March of Athletes at the beginning of the games, he walked way behind all the rest of the British athletes to make it clear he wasn't with those guys, right? He then, this is an amazing act of political dissent at the 1906 Olympics, won a silver medal. And at the awards ceremony, he ran over to the flagpole where the Union Jack was hoisted up, shimmied his way up the thing, pulled down the Union Jack, held up an Erin go Bragh, Ireland Forever flag, and his buddy stood guard at the bottom so that the police couldn't come get him. Epic act of political dissent, 1906. So there's a long tradition of this. Moving forward a little bit, the woman who looks extremely unhappy on the far left is named Alice Miliott, a French athlete who was instrumental in bringing more women to the Olympics. As many of you will know, women were largely excluded from the early days of the Olympic Games. And so what she did was she actually started something along with her comrades called the Women's Olympics. They had 4 of them, numerous athletes from around the world attended. So this was in the 1920s and 30s. Shimmy ahead a little bit further. Oops. To Vera Kozlovska. She was at the 1968 Olympics, a Czech athlete who managed to train for the Olympics after the Soviet Union had invaded Czechoslovakia. She found a safe place to train, made it there, made it to the medal stand. And when the Russian national anthem played, she sort of subtly dipped her head in protest. The whole world, of course, noticed that. That was at those same 1968 games as this athlete made a subtle gesture. Some people call it the shaft. Some other people call it the FU gesture. This is a Polish athlete who won the pole vault and who was also expressing his political dissent. Going to another athlete at that time, around that time frame, I should say, 1968, backstepping to the 1968 Olympics, where Wyoming Tayus, an incredible athlete, she protested by wearing black shorts. She didn't wear the official shorts that were white that were given to her. So she did a subtle protest. And she also supported what Tierra was talking about before, this epic gesture of political dissent, John Carlos and Tommy Smith. Now, I just want to take a little step to the side to say that while we look back on a lot of these actions today and we go, wow, amazing, this is incredible, I'm so glad they did that. They actually got quite a lot of pushback, negative press at that time. This is just one example from the US press of that gesture of Smith and Carlos. And this is from a guy who is still in the industry, Brent Musburger, who does commentary on the television even today. He called them a pair of black-skinned stormtroopers, and you can see some of the other things that he said about the gentleman. Well, history has kind of won out. Barack Obama actually honored Smith and Carlos at the White House during President Obama's tenure. And I think that sort of gives us a little bit of a lesson about the rear view window of history when it comes to athlete activism. They might get a lot of flack in the moment that they act, but in the long run, they tend to be seen on the correct side of history. I think that's something to keep in mind when we hear about these other modern day athlete activists. 1972, Vincent Matthews and Wayne Collett won gold and silver in the 400 meters. And you can see there, Wayne Collett off to the left did not wear shoes on the medal stand. And they did not look very interested in the proceedings. At one point, Matthews kind of twirled his medal around on his finger. And they got, excuse my language, hell for what they did. They actually were kicked out of the Olympic movement, and they are still kicked out to this day. And we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of their action. I think there's well past time that we make up and change that situation. After they did that, that's when this rule came into the Olympic Charter. That's when the International Olympic Committee said, whoa, we got to solidify a rule that says you can't engage in this sort of thing. Has it stopped athletes? It has not. I'm going to shimmy ahead in time here to the contemporary era. This is Alexei Sobolev, a Russian snowboarder who at the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics, once he got to the bottom of his ski run, he posed next to his snowboard. And if you look carefully at that, you can see a balaclava-clad person wielding a knife, an allusion to the art and activist collective Pussy Riot, which was one of the very few groups that took to the streets during the actual Sochi Olympics in Russia. And they were literally whipped, like bullwhipped by Cossacks for their efforts. I wanted to be sure to highlight someone else who is in the modern era, who just lives down the road from us here in Copenhagen. This is Lawrence Halstead, two-time British Olympian and a heck of a wonderful guy who has now since then started a new project called True Athlete Project that I encourage you to learn more about. It's happening right here in Denmark. He spoke out and really questioned as to whether the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, was truly living up to its commitments that it says out loud about environmentalism. Shimmy forward to the 2016 Olympics, Fayesa Lilesa of Ethiopia crossed his hands as he earned the silver medal in the marathon as gesture to his Oromia people in solidarity back home who were being persecuted by the government at that time. And finally, just very recently, in what I view as an epic act of political dissent at the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, we have Raven Saunders here, the US shot putter who won a medal, and she crossed her hands above her head during the medal ceremony in an act of solidarity with oppressed people from around the world. One other example that I wanted to point to was these two athletes, cyclists from China, who wore Mao pins on their garments as they stood on the medal stand. So what I guess I'm trying to point out here is that there might be rules on the books that say athletes can't engage in protest, but you can't necessarily stop committed people who are willing to stand up for their cause. Interestingly enough, despite that rule being on the books in the Olympic Charter, the IOC did not crack down on any of these athletes in a major way like they did on the athletes from 1972, Matthews and Collett, or like they did on the athletes in 1968, Smith and Carlos. I would argue that that is because the International Olympic Committee is at a relative weak point in terms of its power, in the sense, at least its popularity, in the sense that you have all these athletes speaking out because of all these other movements. So I want to very quickly go through a swift history of some of these movements related to the Olympics and otherwise. Denver 1976 Olympics, you're looking at that going, wait a minute, I don't remember the 1976 Olympics in Denver. That's because they never happened, because a group of people, once those games had been awarded to Denver, people across the political spectrum, sort of liberal environmentalist types, as well as fiscal conservative types, came together, got a measure on the ballot saying we're not going to give any public money to these Olympics, and they won the ballot measure. The IOC knew that they could not host the Olympics if they didn't have public money, and they moved them to Innsbruck, Austria. More recently, we've seen between 2013 and 2018, around a dozen cities just say no to hosting the Olympic Games. This is from Hamburg, where they had a referendum and people voted, a majority voted not to have them. Same with Innsbruck, Austria. They just said no recently. In my home country of the United States, Boston, once they were awarded the United States slot for applying for the Olympics, they said no to the Olympics. The United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee then turned around and handed it to Los Angeles, where there's a vibrant anti-Olympics movement happening right now. That group in Los Angeles was instrumental in creating the first ever transnational anti-Olympic summit in Tokyo. So this was right outside the Olympic Stadium in Tokyo in July 2019. You can see one of the activists from Tokyo with the Olympic poverty torch that was created in Vancouver by activists there. It moved its way London, it made its way to activists from the Sochi area, and then it made its way to Rio de Janeiro, Pyeongchang, Tokyo, and it was just handed off a few weeks ago to activists in Paris. This is from a large mobilization that I attended in July in Tokyo, where activists came from around the world. But it's not just these Olympics. These kind of protests have been happening even before that, raising the profile of the critiques. This is from Rio de Janeiro, where I lived as a Fulbright Research Fellow in 2015 and was there in 2016 for the Olympics. This was a photo I took of a community called Miliott that was booted off the map to make way for an Olympic parking lot. 300 families lost their homes to make way for an Olympic parking lot. I mentioned that there were protesters against the Sochi Olympics, including many from the United States. Unfortunately for them, it wasn't a safe thing to do to go protest in Russia, so you saw more protests around the world. London, where I mentioned I was living then, that one of the main themes was greenwashing, talking a big environmental game with the Olympics, but not actually following through. This was the Greenwash Gold campaign. They're in Trafalgar Square, and they dumped green custard on their heads, and they were actually arrested for their efforts there by the police. And one of their restrictions for bail was that they couldn't attend any more anti-Olympics protests. And finally, I just want to point out that every one of the protests that happens is not just a one-size-fits-all model. It reflects the characteristics of the city. And so this is from Vancouver, where there's a huge First Nations Indigenous presence. And so you have the kind of slogans, no Olympics on stolen native land. So what I'm suggesting to you today is that when we hear about contemporary athlete activism, that it's really wider movements that are either against the Olympics that I was focusing on, or these wider important movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter, or many other vibrant social movements around the world that make space for these moments of athlete activism. And while it might seem like the International Olympic Committee is extremely powerful and impossible to beat, I would remind you via Stuart Hall that hegemony is never forever. Thank you very much.
All right, so now we're going to have two case studies presented to show how athletes are represented today and suppressed today. And so our next speaker up is Mads Brix Bauerland.
That's a nice background.
Perfect.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. There we go. Yeah. Perfect. Should you use the microphone or just speak loud?
I think speaking loud.
Yeah, okay. Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Mads Bauerland, and I am a member of the Danish Athlete Commission, or Athlete Committee, depending on what you want to call it. I'm here to talk to you about the perspective seen from the Danish Athlete Committee, but also from Parasports, where I'm from. So I am a former goalball player. Goalball is a sport for the visually impaired or blind persons. And I have a visual impairment, of course. I have around 5% of my sight left. And I am an below the knee amputee after an accident in 2016, where I kind of stopped my career. So I've been in parasports for many, many years, since around 2002. And I am still in parasports in the Danish National Paralympic Association, Parasport Denmark, where I do volunteer work. I'm part of different committees and so on. So I was elected to the Danish Athletes Committee back in 2017. In Denmark, you elect members in the way that you have representatives from different groups of athletes. They are elected to the Athletes Committee, which then, advises, talks to, makes political activism and so on to the what's it actually called in English? Anyone know what DIF is called in English?
Danish Olympic Committee.
Is it just Danish Olympic Committee?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Now I know too. Yes.
Well, I tell my students, so.
Okay, perfect. I'm sure you're right. So let's say the Danish Olympic Committee, the job of the committee is to advise the Danish Olympic Committee and to be part of ensuring that athletes have a voice in the Olympic Committee. So I was elected for parasports. You also have someone elected for some Olympic sports, Winter Olympic sports, non-Olympic sports, and so on, and so on, and so on. And all in all, you have a group of 9 persons elected for the Athlete Committee. So the role of the Athlete Committee is, as I said, to advise. It is to ensure that athletes have a voice. So what does that mean? Well, it's kind of difficult to say. And that is maybe one of the issues with the Athletes Committee, because the Athlete Committee is run by athletes, and it is supposed to be run by athletes. This is also one of the tricky parts, because athletes are not professionally trained to run committees or organizations. So you can be elected and have lots of experience. I have around 15 years of experience of lobbying and doing committee work and so on when I was elected. So there are other athletes who are elected and have none whatsoever. This makes it a bit uneven, to say the least, both internally in the Athlete Committee, and it can also make it so that the Athlete Committees have, I might say, varying quality. It's not the quality itself, but it is the ability to influence the Olympic Committee. And this is I think one of the issues with the committee. It has been the way that all athletes have been, or all members of the athlete committee have been elected and then been substituted or changed or re-elected at the same time. This has now been changed. So for the first time in 2020, we actually had a committee where some of the members stayed and wasn't on election, which ensures that some of the work going on from the last period has been part of the new work and has been part of the new process of ensuring athletes have a voice. There is a question whether an athlete committee is an appropriate way to ensure that athletes can say what they want, can have the influence which they, as I see it, are entitled to. And you could argue that actually a political committee would speak more to someone with, for instance, a high education, or as you see in the rest of the society, if you have a high education, you're more, the chance of you going into, for instance, politics or having more influence is higher than if you have a lower education. Could also be because of gender, disability, or some of the other diversity issues that we are dealing with. So that's the critique. The thing that might work about an athlete committee, as we see it here in Denmark, is that we actually have quite a good teamwork and cooperation with the internal organizations and with, for instance, let's say the board, the executive board of the Danish Olympic Committee. Now that makes it possible to have census around a lot of things, a lot of issues, being able to discuss something, to actually make agreements that work without having to make a big problem out of it, without having to have a big discussion. Again, this is also the danger of having too much census, if you could say it like that. So the danger is also that you actually end up clearing out a lot of stuff that should actually have been brought up for discussion with the entire athlete group. So it is really difficult to say whether the athlete committee is the right way to go about it, at least in the form it is now. One of the things I meet a lot is the question, do you really think athletes would be interested in blah, blah, blah? Do you think athletes, do they really have an opinion about that? Well, and I'm always like, yeah, of course they do. Why shouldn't they? It concerns them. So I think that's one of the struggles we have. It's the kind of prejudice, actually, that athletes are just athletes. We have seen now, Hans Natorp, the chairman of the Danish Olympic Committee, he went out after the invasion of Ukraine and said, we're not giving an inch in regards to Russia and all this. So we want the Russians excluded. That was his, he said that in a press statement. So we've seen the walls between sport and politics come crumbling and crashing down. And that's really, really interesting. As I see it, and that's me personally, not me speaking for the entire athlete committee, but as I see it, this has been the case for many, 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 many years. Of course, sports and politics have been tightly entangled. But now it's been clear to everyone that they are entangled. And it's really interesting that this is happening, because now we actually as athletes have to take a stance. We can't hide anymore behind, well, I'm just an athlete. But it also means that the ones who are supposed to listen has to actually ask the athletes, what do you think? What do you want? What do you need? And so on and so on and so on. Not just for making results, but having to trust in athletes having a valid opinion that matters. I also want to touch on one of the topics I'm sure we're going to talk about in a bit, but the rise of independent athlete committees or player or athlete associations. This is a really, really interesting and important topic because it puts to question, is the athlete committee the ones representing the athletes? Before, the answer was just yes, of course. But if you ask the athletes how many know about the athlete committee in Denmark, how many know what we do? I'd say it's probably very, very small percentage actually knowing anything about it. And I think that's part of actually also been raised with you're just an athlete, so you don't have to think about anything politically. And we have to stop raising athletes and influencing athletes, just not having to care. So if we do that, we'll have more active athletes that voice their opinions and actually have opinions that are worth listening to. But this also means that there are different independent organizations popping up. Some of them are probably very worth listening to. At the moment, we don't have that much cooperation between independent and let's just call the athlete committee the organized or the old way of representing athletes. There aren't that much cooperation. So it's traditionals and the new ones working in not different directions, but parallel directions, you might say. The danger, as I see it, is that you have some player associations also popping up that are more like player or athlete unions. Now, these organizations are a bit more dubious, I'd say, because they want to represent athletes, but they mainly want to represent the lucrative athletes. So the athletes in, for instance, tennis, in soccer, in handball, the big sports in Denmark. But if I come up as a women's rugby player and say, do you want to represent me? Like, yeah. And that's kind of the danger with having independent athlete organizations. And it's well worth the debate, I think.
About 1 minute more.
Yeah. Yes, I think the last thing I want to touch on is the Paralympic versus the organized or the some called able-bodied sports. I don't know, just sports, whatever. But the Paralympic way of organizing is a bit more in Denmark, at least. It's so small, so it's very tight. So many athletes, if they have a problem, they go directly to the elite manager, for instance, instead of coming to me as an athlete representative. It's just easier. So people come to the athletes committee in the Olympic committee, and there are some differences here that are also worth exploring. I think that's about my time, and we can always take up the rest in the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next up, Jörg Krieger.
For the last time. Yep.
I'm trying to change.
Yeah.
You did it.
No, I don't think I shared the screen.
We just need to go back here. And pick yours. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Super. Thank you for a really good start to this debate and to this panel. And I will, also dive into a more specific issue, and you've seen the book enough now. I know, but now I actually want to talk a little bit about the contents of it, not the format. present that case of activism and protest in this sport of modern pentathlon, which actually details and exemplifies a lot of the issues that have just been raised already, and also that Mats was drawing on. So the focus really is on how an international governing body of sport, that is the Modern Pentathlon Union, has actively suppressed athletes' voices. And that is what I'm trying to show in the book as well. And I'm really sorry for the air conditioning that I think is going a little bit crazy here.
I thought something very quick.
Yeah, I also thought someone is making notes, but wow. Anyway, so give you a little bit of context. The sport of modern pentathlon consists of 5 disciplines: swimming, fencing, horse riding, laser, and a laser run that consists of shooting and of running, obviously. And that sport is not a sport that we see on television a lot. I usually only ever see modern pentathlon on television when the Olympics are on. And that is also not a huge surprise, because that sport was created by Pierre de Coubertin in the early 20th century as a specific sport for the Olympics, and the athlete doing modern pentathlon supposed to represent the cavalry officer and going through those different disciplines. So it is a sport that had been purposefully created for the Olympic Games. And that, as we will see, ties it very closely to that event. And also ties that sport very closely to the International Olympic Committee, even though it has its own international sports federation, the UIPM, as the governing body. We also see a lot of modern pentathlon on YouTube. When athletes are riding at events and you see them crashing into the obstacles, or the horses wouldn't be going over the obstacles. So clearly serious animal welfare issues going on in that sport. And the last time we saw that happening on a bigger stage was at the Tokyo Olympics, when we had a German rider, Annika Schleu, who was in a leading position at that time, could not get her horse, Saint Boy, to perform and compete and go over the obstacles. I say her horse, but it is not her personal horse. In modern pentathlon, you get allocated a horse. So the horses are being provided by the federation, and then it's sort of a lottery, and draws are being pulled, and you get allocated a specific horse. So it's not your horse that you are riding. And we also need to know that these horses are being used multiple times in multiple rounds for the men and for the women. And what happened here with Annika Schleu was that in the previous round, a rider was not very skillful and wasn't able to get that horse really over those obstacles. And then when it was supposed to go again, the horse didn't want to go, right? That's a little bit of context to that. There were then severe issues. The coach said, you need to hit the horse properly. She broke down in tears, hit it with the whip, and these videos went viral quite rightly. They actually faced criminal charges in Germany for their actions, and those were settled in February this year. But anyway, so there is an issue here. That there's no doubt about that. Now, the federation immediately after these incidents, this particular incident, constantly came out and protected the horses and the horse riding discipline. They said, no, this is a problem of the riders. In particular, the riders are not skillful enough to ride those horses. We're definitely going to stick with the horse riding in our event. And then in an emergency board meeting that was called a couple of hours officially before it was held at the end of October last year, the UIPM Executive Board decided to drop horse riding from modern pentathlon. There was no consultation of the athlete community. There was an athlete committee chair on that executive board, but obviously with that very short time period, she certainly had not the time to get any feedback from the athletes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And that decision to remove horse riding and propose modern pentathlon without horse riding for the Los Angeles 2028 Olympics had to be done because, or there was a little bit of a rush to do that because the IOC met to decide upon the program for LA 2028 in early December. Currently, modern pentathlon is taken off the Olympic program because they have only 4 disciplines, right? But as soon as a 5th discipline is found, the IOC will reevaluate whether modern pentathlon potentially will make it into the program or not. What that led to was an uproar in the athlete community, or in the modern pentathlon community, I should say. There was a petition out very briefly, a couple of days after the event, after the board meeting, that 667 athletes had signed protesting against that decision, which is quite a high number. I mean, modern pentathlon is not the most widespread of sports. There was a letter sent to Thomas Bach, the IOC president, by former Olympic champions, Olympic medalists, very briefly after as well. At the moment, we are at the point where we know that a replacement discipline is most likely going to be obstacle course racing. So that is your Spartan race type of event that is currently being trialed by the federation. And I have absolutely nothing to do with modern pentathlon. But due to previous work that I'd been done, I was called up by a gatekeeper and said, look, there's this stuff going on in modern pentathlon. Why don't you look at that? Because there are some governance issues here. So I did in late last year and explored and talked to the protesters, to activists, to organizations supporting the athletes in their protests against the federation. So very quickly, I was able to get interviews with 38 current and former athletes, other activists involved around athletes activism in general, but also the sport. And we talked a little bit about in the session on governance about making choices on methodology, and I made a conscious decision not to speak to UIPM and Sport Federation people, because I wanted to really explore that athlete activism here and see their arguments and contrast them with what was the UIPM officials said in the public domain. And what I quickly realized was that here we had violations of transparency, of democracy, of accountability going on. I could figure out that the UIPM has federations that only exist on paper, that voted in these votes, that, you know, term limits issues. The president is in place since 1992. He's the longest serving president of an Olympic sport federation. So not a huge turnover. But what I want to focus on for the next 3 minutes, if Tiara allows me, is the suppression of athletes' voices, because that's what we're here for. And just these 5 bullet points, which demonstrate some of the issues on display. Now, the first one is the athletes' commission chair that was pressured to vote for the drop of horse riding and was not allowed technically, officially, to communicate with the other athletes and other athletes commission members about making a decision here. I have seen emails of executive board members writing to the athlete commission chair, making clear you have to vote it like that or this will have consequences. We have a new athlete commission chair there in place at the moment. It's an Egyptian athlete called Yasser Hafni. He is not an athlete, he's a former athlete. And as such, he's the national coach of the Egyptian modern pentathlons. So he's de facto an employee of the Egyptian Modern Pentathlon Federation. And the president of the Egyptian Modern Pentathlon Federation is the vice president of the International Federation. So the question is, how independent can Yasser Hafni actually represent the interests of the athletes? There's issues with one-way communication. They had meetings and athletes weren't allowed to ask questions. It was just one-way communication. I could also demonstrate that some UIPM executive board members were spying on athletes' communication. It means that they were members of their WhatsApp and Telegram chat groups under fake names. And then when the numbers were added, it was quickly realized this was actually executive board members. So young athletes were blackmailed to remain silent, shouldn't engage in protests. So that was, they were being told, if you protest, you will lose your place on the national team by federation people. And also when the UIPM was sort of forced to let the athletes include in some working groups, it was the UIPM who selected the athletes, right? But there was no democratic protest so that the athletes could send whoever they want. So taking together, and we'll kind of discuss this more, but clearly what I've figured is that the current athletes representation structures are flawed in that sports. But I also want to echo what Matt said, namely that these athletes are really highly engaged in the politics of their sport. And saying the athletes have no time for that, they're concerned with issues, that was certainly not the case. But of course, these activists need also to make feasible reform suggestions, right? In the debate that we had, I played a game on that topic the other day. I mean, modern pentathlon is quite a inaccessible sport. There are issues with diversity. Not everyone has access to a horse. So the athletes need to make sure that they propose alternatives that are also realistic if they want to be successful in this particular case. Super, thank you. Now you know what's in the book.
And our final speaker before we get into our debate is going to talk about the International Independent Athletes Organizations and move to a new approach.
While Jorg is getting it ready, this is sport a wonderful place, hearing how athletes are treated. Just very quickly, I'm going to give you a quick background about myself, just to put in context how I ended up here. For 18 years, I worked for the World Anti-Doping Agency. I resigned in August 2018. I was responsible for the Russian file, bringing Russia back to compliance. And athletes were very clear that they wanted Russia to be banned, and the organization that I work for didn't really want that. So I had to make a decision and I left the organization. And now I'm here speaking about athletes. So thank you for having me. I guess the first thing, I can't see this in my glasses, but the first thing I wanted to identify right off the start is who is making changes and pushing for change in international sport, both the Olympic and the Paralympic movement. And the answer is very clear. We just heard from Jörg, we've heard from Jules, that it's not sport administrators. And when I, if you need them, yeah, okay. When I put sport administrators, I'm also putting sport administrators along with athlete administrators. Because when an athlete becomes a member of the International Olympic Committee or the Paralympic Committee Athlete Commission, they have a fiduciary duty with those committees. They must do what they tell them to do. They do not represent athletes. And I will give you some stories exactly how I can defend that. But who is pushing for change? It's the athletes. The athletes are finally standing up and saying, we are fed up and we are ready to speak up, in part because they found these organizations out there, one being Global Athlete, others Athletes Deutschland. We work with Athletes Canada, those world players who are not afraid of the powers and who are 100% backing the athletes from a grassroots bottom-up approach. And this has resulted in significant change globally. And I'll give you some examples where sport has done nothing. There's a thing called Rule 40, where if you're an Olympic or Paralympic athlete, you cannot take sponsors to the games. You couldn't thank the sponsors. You couldn't do anything. So these athletes trained for years. They get their one moment of the spotlight. They don't get paid to go to the Olympics. They get zero or the Paralympics, and they can't bring their own sponsors. So unpaid labor, basically. What we did with Athletes Germany is take this to court, and the rule was relaxed. So it's athletes driving the change to relax it a little bit. Now athletes can thank sponsors. Now athletes can send out a tweet thanking sponsors. Still not far enough, but it's a start. We talked about Rule 50 in the IOC. Rule 50, when Jules was talking, you were not allowed to talk about social racial justice in the media, at press conferences, on the field. As soon as the Olympic or Paralympic Games, in the Paralympics, it's Rule 2.1, you could not talk about anything. So the Olympics was an area where they talk about building trust, building truce, building inclusion, but during Olympic Games, that doesn't exist. So everyone's quiet. Athletes were not happy with this, and they didn't want history to repeat itself. So it was athletes that got together. We had 14 athlete groups, one including the Danish Athlete Committee, who got together and stood up and said, this is not acceptable. We backed it by research, we backed it by human rights experts, and through the media, we pushed the IOC to relax the rule. So now an athlete can talk about social racial justice issues at media conferences. They can talk about it outside the village, but they still can't take the podium to raise a fist. That's still restricted. It was a significant change, but not enough. And coming into Tokyo, we thought, how can we help these athletes if they want to take a podium? Freedom of expression is a basic human right, and sport doesn't have the right to supersede those rules and laws. So what we did was we brought together 40 human rights lawyers and told every athlete at these games, if you stand up, you take a podium, you want to wear a rainbow badge, whatever you want to do, we will fight and defend you till the end. Jules showed, we saw arms crossed. We saw soccer players wear rainbow bands. What did the IOC do? Nothing. Athlete activism. We have seen other examples in terms of the postponement of the Olympics and Paralympics. This is how out of touch the IOC and the IPC were. I would say more the IOC. In March 2020, the world shut down. Everyone was told to stay at home, isolate, don't go out. But the IOC said to the athletes, we need about 4 or 5 weeks to determine whether they're going to cancel these games. Continue training and preparing for the games. It was ridiculous. So athletes, in fact, that we were working with were jumping fences, we're breaking laws, and we're doing things that they shouldn't be doing in their communities, and we're setting a bad example. So over a period of 4 days, we mobilized athletes from around the globe. We were vocal, we stood up, and we went public again and demanded the IOC postpone the games immediately. Athletes took to social media. Within 24 hours, the IOC made an announcement that the games will be postponed. Athlete activism was successful. We have other examples of, let's take Belarus. You had athletes in Belarus who were protesting the illegitimate election of Lukashenko. And those athletes that were speaking up were being put in jail by Lukashenko, were being threatened, and their families were being threatened. What did the IOC do? Nothing. They ignored it. The Belarusian athletes formed a group called the Belarusian Sport Solidarity Federation. We partnered with them, and these brave athletes did not stop. And what happened is they ended up getting Lukashenko, who was also the president of the National Olympic Committee, banned and suspended. He was removed, and he gave his son the position. Again, we protested, he was removed. And now the Belarusian National Olympic Committee is partially suspended. Not enough, but it was that athlete activism that had the IOC take action. We looked at what athletes have done in the United States for equal pay. It was the athletes that stood up. It wasn't sport leaders saying, you know what, women should have equal pay like men. No, it was the athletes that had to take that athlete activism. We have USA Gymnastics. We have survivors that have never given up. And I apologize because I deal with we deal with a lot of sexual abuse issues, and these athletes never stopped speaking up. As a result, they got a lawsuit, they won a lawsuit, they came and they fought and fought and fought, and their voices are being heard. We had, imagine having a baby and you're going to the Olympic Games in Tokyo, and you're told you can't bring your baby. The IOC said because of the pandemic, we don't care if you're breastfeeding your babies, you cannot bring them to the Olympic Games. It's just so out of touch. So what we did is we worked with these athletes saying, let's be vocal. Let's get up and stand up and make sure you're heard. And we did that. But one thing that we did that nobody knew is we worked with 14 women-led breastfeeding organizations in the US to put together a full-page ad for the New York Times. When we did that, we were ready to stand up and call the IOC out. Thankfully or not thankfully, I don't know, but that letter was leaked to the IOC the day before it was going to be published. So we saved $25,000, which is great. And the athletes were allowed to go to bring their babies to Tokyo for breastfeeding their babies. So another out of touch, but athlete activism that mattered. We have examples of athlete activism being vulnerable. Naomi Osaka, Simone Biles, refusing to compete because their social and their mental health wasn't ready for it. Imagine 3-4 years ago even, an athlete saying, I'm vulnerable. They had did it and made a difference. You had handball athletes who were being required to stand and play in skimpy bikinis, out of touch. Who's making those rules? Old men. The athletes stood up, the rule was changed. We had the World Anti-Doping Agency, who has lost all confidence in athletes. You had 14, the same 14, including the Danish Olympic Committee, stand up and demand reform. Still hasn't gone far enough, but it's been a start. So it's been amazing athlete activism. And every time I talk to the athletes or sport administrators, they say, you're not doing much. And then we show them, and this is a small example of what athletes have done. And I always hear athlete's voice is on the rise, but the athlete's voice on the rise is not enough. It's not even close to enough. And I'll give you some examples where it's not enough. We had Vlad, which you mentioned, from Ukraine, stand up at the Beijing Olympic Games to go out and put a vest on no war. Leading into those games, the Chinese authorities threatened every athlete. If you speak up, you will be under Chinese law and potentially prosecuted. The IOC said, well, we have to abide by the laws of the country we're in. So if you're part of that, we can't really do anything. So we actually went out and told athletes to be quiet. For an organization that is promoting freedom of expression and supporting athletes' values, we actually told athletes to be quiet because we had no power. They have no power. And the IOC left them in a very difficult, vulnerable position. But Vlad decided to do it. And the consequences to Vlad were nothing. Nothing happened. But what did happen is Vlad got in touch with us. And of course, you know what happened as soon as the Olympic Games were over is Russia invaded Ukraine. And the Ukrainian athletes realized the Paralympics was coming. And you had Russian and Belarusian athletes who were going to be competing at the Paralympics. The International Paralympic Committee said, we are allowing them to compete, we are inclusive, we are bringing everyone together. The Ukrainian athletes reached out to Global Athlete, and we came up with a strategy. And the first was, let's be a community of athletes. So we worked with them to garner support of over 1,000 athletes to sign a petition to call for the Russian and the Belarusian Paralympic committees to be banned. That list also included the vice chair and the chair of the Russian Olympic Committee Athlete Commission and her teammates. The IPC came forward and said, made a press statement and rejected any call for a ban. The next day we went out with a video with the Ukrainian athletes and again posted the information online. 24 hours later, the outcry from the public, the Russian and Belarusian athletes were suspended from the Paralympic Games, athlete activism. But as I said, the voice is not enough. In 4 years ago, a young wrestler named Navid Afkari, he was arrested for peacefully protesting, but it was a setup where he was indicated he committed a crime and murdered someone, all falsified. We worked for probably 2 weeks to try to save his life. We asked for the IOC to threaten the Iranian National Olympic Committee. If anything happens to Navid, you will be suspended. The IOC did nothing. Navid was murdered by the Iranian regime. We have 1,000 athletes in Canada that have claims of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. Canadian government has done nothing. The voice is not enough. What's needed moving forward is we need to move away from this forced change because it's hurting the brand, it's hurting athletes, it's hurting sport, and we need to have a collective approach. And what we're calling for is we need now a collective bargaining agreement where athletes are a 50-50 partner. Sport is for and by the athletes, and they have no say other than coming up, making themselves vulnerable, and speaking publicly. That needs to change. We are working with the various groups to push for that change, and that momentum is not going to stop because athlete activism is on the rise, and they deserve 50% of all decisions being made in sport. 1 minute.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, presenters. We're going to invite you to come and to take a seat. Where will you play? I'll find a sit chair wherever you all go.
Where do you want to sit?
I guess I'll
put you in the middle.
Oh, okay.
That way it doesn't look like a mantle.
I love it.
Yeah. So take pictures from here.
Yeah.
So again, thank you for all of your presentations, for the connections, not only to athlete activism, but also in considerations of representation, but also suppression as well. So thank you for that clear and concise message. I want to take a time to ask one question to you all. And again, this is more of a debate than it is, me leading the show or facilitating in that way. So please feel free to answer as you feel. And then also we'll take some questions from the audience as well. So get your questions ready so that when we call on you, we'll have these wonderful presenters give that information to you all.
Did you call us prisoners?
If it was an accident, but hey, Freudian slip. No, I'm just kidding. So the question that I have for you is, activism is sometimes thought of as a burden for athletes because of, again, the ideas that athletes are really busy or, in a lot of cases, they come with these different forms of vulnerability or in some cases, depression. And so I want to know your thoughts on that. Do you feel like this thought of activism is a burden? Do you feel like it's a burden worth taking? What are your thoughts?
Well, I can start.
Yeah, please.
I mean, for sure, it's worth doing, I think. I think we have to respect both those who want to be activists, who want to do something political with their athlete career, and we have to respect those who don't want to. And I mean, it's easy to say, it's actually a bit harder to do because also those who haven't, who actually say, I'm not interested in that, they'll also get the same questions and as those standing up and saying, I am interested, I want to make this difference, and so on and so on. So we have to ensure that there's room enough for both types of athletes, but we have to train our athletes so they know what they can have an opinion about, what they can go out and, be activists about. Many athletes don't know that right now, and that's really a shame because the consequences are great, as you shown, Rob. It's huge.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Agree. If we force athletes to take a position on something, we're no better than anybody else. So it's their choice. And when we, for example, when we come with issues like we've shown today, we invite them. Would you like to join us? If the answer is no, that's fine. Maybe there's another issue tomorrow you want to join us. But I totally agree with you, Nats.
Yeah. I love the idea of invitation. I think that's such a powerful way of thinking about bringing people on into activism.
Can I actually give you a quick example?
Yeah, please.
Because we actually sat down in the Danish Athlete Commission and had a discussion about Russia, saying, okay, so what do we do? And someone from cycling had said, well, what's the big deal? We don't have to deal with that, actually. We don't have to take a stand on it because when I go out and cycle, what's the problem? I can just cycle next to someone else. But I said, yeah, okay. But what if you're a tennis player? What if you have to reach out and give a handshake to a Russian player? That's a completely different picture for the press, for the media, and so on, than you cycling next to someone. So the knowledge that athletes have about the consequences, I see and that was the Athlete Commission. That's where we're supposed to know, but we're not trained. We don't have any experience. We can be lucky. I have a lot of experience, but that's because I've been doing a lot of disability work and so on. That's just a coincidence. We have to train our athletes better.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it points to the importance of groups like Global Athlete and some of the independent athlete groups that have popped up that can provide that scaffolding and provide information that can lead to the confidence necessary to stand up in the public sphere. I will use the example of, and I totally agree with what Mads said, that not everybody is cut out for it. And maybe they are later in their life, but not when they're 18, 19. And I'll give the example of myself. When I was younger, I had the good fortune of playing for the US under-23 men's soccer team. 19 years old, playing an international tournament in France. And if somebody would have stuffed a microphone in my face and said, what do you think about the US foreign policy and this and that? I cringe to think what I might have said. I was so uninformed.
Yeah.
And so it's definitely not for everybody, but I think the more scaffolding that we have in place, the more it'll be friendly for people to work up the courage to speak out on these important issues.
So in my case, where I spoke to these athletes, we have a little bit of a different scenario because they're all directly impacted by the policy, right? So if you take that horse riding away, they potentially cannot do their sport anymore on that level that they previously did it.
Right.
So there was a stronger interest because it affected them personally much more. But I can only echo those words. When I spoke to the athletes, they also said, but we don't know how far we can go. What can we do, right? That they were not informed. And even though then this independent athlete group, Pendleton United, formed, they're slowly trying to provide some guidance. They had no experience in that whatsoever.
Yeah, and I really love the thing that you said as well of the fact of they're already burdened by the sport in itself if this policy gets taken away or is implemented, and that's something to consider as well. You know, when we're thinking about particular, again, athletes who are systemically oppressed, they're already oppressed. And so in that situation, the burden is already on them. How much more burden is it to speak out about it, right? So I thank you.
Just add one thing.
Absolutely.
There's also a benefit to the athlete should they want to do it. A quick story, Johan Koss. I'm sure people know Johan Koss is an Olympic speed skater, big supporter of us. And I was with him and Alex and Felix from the United States. Yes. And Johan said to her, he goes, you know, we were having dinner and he's like, no one cares about you. Like there's multi-gold medalists here. He says, no one cares about our gold medals. Nobody. So it lasted for a little bit, but it's what you do after sport matters. And that changed Allison's approach to, she's like, I have life after sport. I want to do something to make the world a better place. And that discussion was like very enlightening to me. It's like, because I could never say that I'm not an Olympic gold medalist.
Right. I'm like, I can't.
What are you? So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. So any questions from the audience for these panelists? Yes?
I have a question. We've talked a lot about some really lovely examples of progressive activism. But of course, there's examples of less progressive activism, particularly since 2016, you know, through the pandemic and stuff. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that and where that fits in with all this.
I can do
Sure, please.
It's a great question. And if you talk to human rights lawyers who are interested in these questions, I'll stick for a moment just to sort of focus my answer on Rule 50 of the Olympic Charter. Human rights lawyers, and also Rob mentioned this, will tell you that there are articles in UN documents, Article 19 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, for example, that says that everybody should have free expression. And so Rule 50 inherently clashes with that. And so human rights lawyers, though, are saying that, okay, it still might not be a bad idea to just scrap Rule 50 entirely. Instead, keep the provision, but modify it in order to make it still prohibited to have hate speech or pro-war propaganda speech inside of the Olympic arena. And so there are ways of circumscribing speech in ways that are accepted in the lawyer world that could cut out some of the really ugly kind of activity you might see. Now, if it's just like a belief that's not necessarily progressive, it might be a conservative political belief, but it's not hate speech and it's not like supporting propaganda for a war, well, then it still should be allowed, these lawyers are saying, inside of that rule, just because you don't agree with it, but if it's not hateful, okay, right? So I think that's one way of thinking through that thicket is through a human rights law perspective, and there are good lawyers who are working on this right now.
Yeah, and if you look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, all the things we talked about there that are in there, we're talking about today. So where Jules says right to freedom of expression, there's limitations. The right to organize, it's a basic human right. the right for transparency and open hearings, like we heard from Jorg. Everything's behind closed doors, nothing's transparent. So all of these things, we're trying to push the IOC to take. We've done a human rights assessment, but we're asking for the IPC and the IOC to embed human rights into their charters. Where all these areas that we have the rights to in most countries, the athletes should have that right when they go through the Olympics.
Yeah, I also think, I mean, the athletes themselves is one part of it. I mean, you could actually take precedence in what was used to kick Russia out. As far as I understood it, at least, it's the peace part of being a part of the Olympic movement. So, I mean, maybe you could use that as precedence for what you would allow. So let's say it's pro-war speech. That's again going against the rules or the rules that about promoting peace and so on. But also, I think we have a huge problem actually regarding the governing bodies. Let me give you an example with the IPC, for instance. I have a bit of inside knowledge regarding the decision about not wanting to ban Russia. They were actually afraid of being sued and being sued for millions. And the problem is that these guys in the International Paralympic Committee are being sued personally if they are being sued. Some of them probably have, I mean, big associations behind them, lots of money and so on, but some of them don't. So some of them are like auditors or, I mean, normal jobs besides being part of the Paralympic Committee. And if you're sued for, I don't know, €1 million or something, I mean, that can have huge personal consequences. So we need to have kind of a system that ensures that a country being kicked out, for instance, can't sue a governing board that are personally responsible. That's crazy.
Yeah, but and Russia uses the method of fear on everybody to think they're going to sue everyone. So it's a
right.
But I think the IPC probably would have been protected under their overall duty of care and their insurance that they have. But that's what the Russians use to threaten everybody. Is we're going to sue you, we're going to take you to court forever.
Right.
Yeah.
I think I saw Brianna's hand next.
Thank you to the panel. Rob, my question is specifically for you, but I would like to hear everyone's thoughts if you have any. I'd just like to know, so again, with, I guess, empowering athletes to be able to speak out, empower, invitation, whatever the case is. So does Global Athlete work with young athletes? And we know many athletes also have like full-time jobs and obviously, healthy, full lives outside of sport. So we might have many athletes who are coaches, for instance. And are they being encouraged to, not kind of take this traditional like authoritarian approach to sport, as far as kind of, you're not going to be kind of comfortable speaking out if everything you've known is to just kind of receive all this information. You're not encouraged to have an active part in your training and your nutrition, all of these things that are a part of your life. Is that something that you are focused on? Do you have resources for this?
Yeah, no, that's your job because you're doing research on it. No, we don't. We're not working with young athletes and advising them on nutrition, or that's not what we do at all.
And it was just an example.
Yeah.
Just in terms of being.
How we work is we're not chasers. We don't chase. We have a high level. What we want, we collective bargaining. We want human rights into the charter. Those are given, but the issues that athletes come forward with, we don't chase them. So they come to us and look for advice. We write letters for them. We provide strategy for them. We write letters and we give it back to them. and they either rip it apart and it's never finalized when we give it to them. And, you know, if example is we had athlete groups calling for resignations of people. And our advice was don't make it personal, or like turn right, we're making it personal. And that was their call. So we released the statement, and it's theirs. So we're just a mechanism and a ability to get things up. And we also provide protection. So we've helped legally, and then the 1,000 Canadian athletes that have come forward, only 5 are known. So we've protected them that way too. So it's various ways that we.
Please.
Just real quick, there is a group that veers toward what you've suggested here. And you remember that dashing fencer I had on the screen before, Lawrence Halstead, lives in Copenhagen. He's with this group, the True Athlete Project, and they're doing mentoring of the variety that I think you're pointing us to, where they're having younger elite athletes getting paired with experienced Paralympians and Olympians and other high-level athletes for mentoring on all sorts of different topics, even the level of like nutrition, public speaking, social issues, how to get trained up in that. And so, yes, the True Athlete Project, and Lawrence has even written a book, I think it's called The True Athlete, that breaks down the philosophy and also the social psychology and individual sports psychology behind the whole big project. So it might be worth looking into if you're interested in that.
Respond quickly. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. Obviously, this is all a mess, and so much energy is spent on like reactively dealing with all of this. And I do think that it's important that there are proactive approaches as well, because I don't want it to be like this forever. So.
Thank you. Yeah. So we have time for one, maybe 2 more questions, but I saw your hand first. Yes, please.
I'll be quick. This question is inspired by Joseph's slide deck, but anybody is welcome to answer it, obviously. You showed photographically moments. You talked about athlete activist moments. What is the power? What is the limitation of a moment?
That's a great question. I guess I'll give it a first go here. And I do think, actually, I think part of the answer lies in what Rob was suggesting at the end of the presentation, that athletes and what they do are not enough in and of themselves. And so if you can wed one of these moments, highly powerful symbolic moments, and you can etch it into history and have movements lift it up and take it forward, then I think that is the recipe for success. Let me just point backwards to what Tierra pointed to at the beginning of the whole panel about that moment in 1968, Tommy Smith and John Carlos. That's not just a moment of sports history. That's a really famous moment of world history. You go to every continent around the world, you poke your head into different apartments, and you'll see a poster of that on numerous people's walls. And so that moment actually symbolizes so much more, symbolizes standing up against the system. Smith and Carlos themselves said it was about Black unity around the globe and fighting Black oppression at home in the United States. So much of the symbology of what they were doing. You know, John Carlos wore a long kind of necklace on pointing to his African roots, but also pointing to the history of lynching in the United States. And so I think that there is, especially in our moment right now of instant gratification being too damn slow, the price so low, who cares about the cost? I would say that there is a little bit of a worry that it'll just get carried away in the next viral push. And maybe it behooves all of us in the room who believe that it should be part of something bigger to try to make it so.
I also have a response to that, because this question very much reminds me of a paper I just read that Lindsay Piper wrote with a colleague, and that is about athletes from particular time periods being frozen in time because of what they did in a particular moment, whether it's the Black Power salute or Jesse Owens, as they write, in 1936. And actually the impact, no one really follows very often what happened afterwards and what the movement did afterwards. So I would say that there is also a certain limitation to that athlete moment. And that is something that we have to be careful about.
You just made me think about the one night in Miami as well, right? That the group of Black men who got together to strategically plan what these next steps were in terms of civil rights and making sure that Muhammad Ali was there so that he could use that stage to be able to push that, the movement, right? It's not just a moment. Yeah, this might be one moment, but the movement behind it is definitely powerful. Thank you for that question. Okay.
But I want to say in response to that historians, we provide a context and also often.
Hopefully.
Talk about, so, things are not frozen in time. I actually saw a fantastic exhibition about the God power in Atlanta. It was really great. But Rob, I think all of you, if I'm reading you right, of the view that countries should be banned, like countries like Russia should be banned from when they do wrong. And I'm just kind of sort of interested where everybody is, because I've been thinking a lot about that. And I lived through South Africa, and South Africa was of course banned, and I was saying, yeah. But I think now, maybe in my old age, I think my mature age, I think athletes have been working for decades, for years, and I'm very much against bans. I think that I can't get behind it. When they took out Russia from Wimbledon, I just thought, what? These are individuals who've devoted their lives to doing a certain thing. And I think there has to be a way to punish the country, as we saw more recently, with the Olympics and Russia not being able to having the individuals, but not having the Russian stage. I think the cost is so high for the individual. Why punish the individual for the crimes of the state? And it's, I've been thinking about that a lot as I see all these American commentators saying, oh yes, these Americans going to Saudi Arabia. And I'm saying, oh wait, but Biden is about to go to Saudi Arabia and he's going to be shaking hands with, the actual killers. There's a certain double standard there to give the country a pass in this case, right? But then to penalize those who are seeking to make a living, right? So I'm interested to see what people here in the audience think about.
I love the question. We're an athlete-led organization, and we called for Russia and Belarus to be banned. That was a very difficult discussion. And the reasoning, so first of all, Belarusian athletes were calling for Belarus to be banned. So they led their charge for their own country to be banned. Because they knew Lukashenko, the same as Putin, will use these athletes as propaganda machines. And he has done that. Gymnast has gone up next to on the medal ceremony with a Z on his chest. You have swimmer, a very, very popular swimmer that was required to wear the same thing. Speedo took all the sponsorship away. My sport was ice hockey, and I know several NHL hockey players that are actually oligarchs because everything has to go back to Russia. So these athletes don't have the freedom that we have. So they are being used as political tools. Maybe this is twisting it, but we see removing them from the competition is actually protecting them. We also see it as protecting other athletes, which Mads, I think, mentioned, where you're having to compete against someone or shake a hand against someone, and all of a sudden these athletes feel complicit. So that's where with the Ukrainian athletes, we had the heads of the Russian Olympic Committee Athlete Commission sign a letter for them to be banned. So that's kind of where we took our lead, and that's where we get our position. We wrote the statements for the tennis players from Ukraine about banning for them. They changed it, but so that's kind of where we approached it. I fully agree with you. The last thing we want to do is see athletes suffer, but I think this is a unique situation under a unique time.
I think with that one as well, most of the global constitutions have one of the objects is everybody has to have the right to be able to train in their home country. And in this case, that's been removed by Russia from Ukraine. So they've actually broken all of the constitutions, the objectives. So when it comes to the legal piece, that's why they can't be sued. Then you have to tie it back from the government to the funding of the federations. And most in Russia, nearly 100% funded by them. So.
Good point.
Can I say one thing? Absolutely. I love the question, and I love the tie back to South Africa. And I just say, maybe set on the table provocatively, intentionally provocatively, that well, what about the United States?
Yep.
And the illegal invasion of Iraq?
Mhm.
Should US athletes have been banned at the 2004 Olympics? If not, why not? I mean, that was an illegal invasion of a country, so just kind of putting it out there. That wasn't even talked about at all.
Yeah.
Global athlete wasn't here though.
Yeah. Tough one for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Okay. Thank you so much for the questions. Thank you, panelists, for everything that you've given today. Let's give them a round of applause. And
Thanks to Tiara as well. And, yeah, so we're going into the last parallel session starting in 12:30.